This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 114.
Fine. I got a better idea. Get them to learn so much so quickly that they're enamored with learning. Imagine getting the memory going to the point where a child could memorize in a short period of time, and this doesn't take that long, much more than an adult could because we don't focus and pay attention. Imagine.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Herman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Matt, still learning how to be a co-host, Rogers.
Ouch!
Hi, Matt.
Learning to be a co-host. Jeez.
That was kind of mean, but once our listeners dig into our show, they'll understand the pun I was going for. So maybe they always say there's truth to everything you say, even if it's a joke, but maybe there was a little bit, but it was more of a pun on our guest tonight. How we doing today, buddy?
I am doing fairly well. We're recording this the day. You know, I did this to myself. I went to an awesome training today. It was called Look Who's Talking. It's based out of Penn State, and it talks about how asking questions and getting answers where kids get correct answers, maybe by luck, masks understanding, and getting incorrect answers block learners from the opportunity and the self-worth in the classroom to push through challenge. And my brain is mush. You will hear this in the interview. I will not hide this fact that I asked a terrible question. I am so sorry to our guests for that. But I was processing so many things, and I did not process my training as well as the great information being shared enough, because boy, oh boy, did Greg bring some fire tonight with some great insight that he has spent a tremendous amount of time looking into.
Yeah, a lot of information and somewhat related to probably what you learned today, which I think probably made it even a little bit more difficult for you because you were blending the two things that sounded similar, but they were probably, if you break down the science, very different. Greg Goodhart was an awesome guest tonight and different from what we've had in the past in terms of the traditional teacher guests that we love to have on the show, but really breaks down the science of how to learning how to learn, memorization, and recalling that information, and ways to actually get students to remember key concepts, key terms, key skills to be able to more successfully work towards higher level thinking. And so while we were recording and afterwards reflecting, it reminded me a lot of Don Berg, who we had on, I believe, 107, who was a psychologist. And we broke down a lot of information in learning the true root of motivation and how students need to feel relatedness, competency, and autonomy to actually be able to be motivated. And so Don had a ton of information that I honestly listened to twice to comprehend it all. And, you know, Greg's similar in the sense that he brings a lot of key information. He leaves us with his website at the end, which is a great resource to dive into that a little bit further. So, you know, I think for me, tonight's show, this episode is about reminding us of key things that we know, learning some key things that we didn't know about the science of learning, and giving us a launch pad to dive a little bit further to see how we can maybe do a little bit of a better job to help our students grasp those key concepts that we teach in our classroom. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think the one component I know I mentioned later in the episode is we trust our college level intro to psychology course and some of our college preparation in pedagogy to be enough of a basis to make judgment on development of kids and how we talk about management of classrooms, as well as how we structure instruction and learning process. There is so much to learn, and the more that you dive into, the better every aspect of teaching will become. And I think that becomes ever present with the interview.
Absolutely. So let's hear from our Teach Better Network and jump right into our conversation with Greg Goodhart.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Greg. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
Hi, Ken. Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. I was digging through your website and a couple other resources that you have out there, and I think tonight's going to be a little bit different for our guests and our listeners to follow along with. So to kick things off, please officially introduce yourself. Let us know where you are coming from and give us a snapshot of your career in education or in relation to education and what you do with teachers.
I'm Greg Goodhart. I call myself the learning coach. I've taught at many different environments at pretty much every level. My last gig was 13 years teaching high school in Orange County. Where I'm from. I'm in Los Angeles. And yes, I commuted to Orange County every day of the school year for 13 years. Believe anyone who knows that. But, that's nothing compared to being in a classroom, right? I'm half joking. So that's my background in education. And, what I do, there's a huge gap between the learning research in psychology, actually cognitive and behavioral psychology and neuroscience, and the actual doing of that thing in the classroom and teachers. That gap is where I live. It's a very, very lonely place, very desolate. And of the few people that are there, it's the Wild West of ideas.
Awesome. I love that. So just for a little bit more background knowledge, when you were teaching high school, what subject was it? And we're going to spend most of our time focusing on, what you just described and what you do now. But if you ran into a student that you had maybe towards the end of your 13 years where you were, getting towards perfecting your craft or being as best as your
not even close
could be. Right. So what did you teach? And if you ran into a student, what would they say about Mr. Goodhart's class?
Okay, well, I was a music teacher, and when I hit the high school, I had to start an entire music program by myself at a school that probably didn't really want one. And I said, I'm going to start a world-class music program. And what's interesting about that is music and any performance that's sports, music, is one of the best places to learn about how learning works, because the goal of all learning is performance. Okay, to perform, not to pass a test, to perform. I understand the testing system, why we have it, and why it's probably the most efficient model we can have in the situation we've been given. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more, because there is some validity to questioning basic knowledge. You can't do this if you don't know this. So performance, right? Well, in the arts and in sports is a little different because you have a coach standing over you most of the time, so you're not as autonomous in your learning as you need to be. To develop it as you might in music or theater or somewhere where you have to go home and do stuff on your own, though there is that element. But anyway, sports does it as well. And you say, what would a student say about me? Well, let's see. The kid who almost tried to get me fired and ended up going to the military came back to me years later and said, I get it now. I'm sorry. They usually come back. Another one came back and said, your classroom was my place of zen. Let's see. And just that it was a safe place, that I was the fairest person they ever met in their life, and they couldn't believe it, how I bent over backwards to be fair to everybody. But that also meant that they had certain obligations, and I would apply those fairly as well. They knew I had their best interests at heart, but that I wasn't going to rubber stamp them. That's probably the best way to talk about it.
So I guess kind of going from that lens, I like the kind of starting off the concept that the performance is what learning's all about. That is the outcome that we're all striving for. looking at it from an elementary school lens perspective, as opposed to higher quality performance products of maybe the high school or even middle school, what are attributes in that performance that you feel trickled down, or ways that you see that performance being valuable appropriately in the elementary realm?
Well, the interesting thing here is the answer to that question, which I will give, the answer to that question is the same for high school, except at the beginning, then they can do more. Okay. What you're asking, what are the very basics there? You start in the same place with high school students. The very basic stuff, which you want to start with, and I function on, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Make It Stick, but it's a wonderful book. And I think they give the most elegant definition of learning I've ever heard, which is acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from memory to make sense of future problems and opportunities. That's what learning is. Now, what I just described after the acquiring knowledge and skills and using them to make sense of future problems and opportunities, that's the action, that's the doing, that's the performance. The acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from memory, and notice I said knowledge and skills, not just memorizing knowledge, that part, first, we're not taught this stuff in school. We are not. Cognitive science, cognitive behavioral neuroscience and psychology are completely siloed from our classes. And I know I'm getting off topic a little bit, but I will bring it back to how that works, that beginning thing. And there was a guy who wrote a paper in a professional journal, psychological journal, and was just lamenting how in the world is the education world not using this. He was talking about a particular thing within retrieval practice called spacing, or spaced repetition, spaced retrieval, which is amazing if you use it right. And he couldn't believe, with all the research that was out there, that it's not being used. That was written in 1988. We're still not doing it. So, going off this definition that I use, and we could have a long discussion about the bad rap memorizing and memory has gotten inappropriately. It's been throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It started in the 1950s. I'm old enough not to remember the 50s, but to know what school was like in the 50s, and to watch the reforms start to happen in the 70s. And how many reforms are we going to have? No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, Congo. How many reforms are we going to have before we get it right? We can't get it right. I always say, doesn't it kind of make sense that maybe some dopey high school music teacher figured it out? So anyway, the first thing you want to do is teach learning. Learn how to learn, okay, which is a big thing. I call it the ecosystem of learning. Deliberate practice, mindset, motivation, what I call motivation through real accomplishment, contextual interference, retrieval practice, flow, and how all these things work together to create the whole package, which is, motivated students who know how to solve problems. Of course, it's our job. If you're familiar with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, whenever I show this to groups of students, where you have the middle part where you feel comfortable, the outer part which you're challenged, and I said, and I look around the room when I say this, wouldn't it be great if there were people in your lives who had so much expertise that they could come up with whatever you needed to stay in the learning zone, but out of the panic zone and not in the comfort zone? Wouldn't it be great if you had professionals around here to do that? That's when I start looking around the room at the teachers, and the kids laugh and they realize that that's what they're doing. And that's why it's slightly uncomfortable. So the first thing I teach is learning how to learn. How about getting stuff into your memory? Gonna have to memorize stuff anyway, whether we like it or not. Gonna have to take standardized tests. We can complain all day long. Gonna have to give tests that aren't open book. Why not get them to memorize stuff first? Because it is entirely possible to memorize as much stuff as you want, hundreds, thousands of pieces of information, and recall it flawlessly. I was listening to something, I think it was one of your podcasts earlier, where people were talking about taking multiple choice tests. And boy, it's kind of a bummer when a kid just guesses. I'll take it one step and gets it right. You're like, that's not, okay, that's how we can do the work and not do the work of learning. I'll take it one step further. And oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. I'll take it one step further than that. What do we do for kids with testing anxiety? We tell them, besides other things, we tell them, read all the answers and then maybe come back to it later. What if you just knew the answer when you read the question? And that's entirely 100% possible all the time. one thing I do when I go in and train teachers is I walk the whole group, the whole theater of them through, it's called dual coding, D-U-A-L, dual coding, C-O-D-I-N-G. And you've probably heard of this. It's called the Palace technique or the method of loci, where you put pieces of information into visual representations in your mind. Okay, so like you use something easy at first, like your home, and you go into different rooms. And I have these people memorize a string of 8 digits, some of them 8 numbers, some of them 2-digit numbers. And we walk through and we do it. And, as we get to the first one takes 90 seconds to 2 minutes, the last one takes 30 seconds. See, you're getting better at it as you learn to do it. You can memorize more quickly. Then we do retrieval practice. We do space retrieval. Every 10 minutes, I have a timer that goes off. And in the middle of me talking about flow or deliberate practice, what are the numbers? We leverage the testing effect, which shows that if you try to retrieve something from memory that is in there, but you cannot retrieve it and it's incorrect, that act makes future retrievals stronger and more accurate. That's right. Testing is a learning tool, not as a summative or formative assessment. As a learning tool itself, getting the answer. Now you have to have low stakes tests to do that. So we get and by the last one, everyone's, yeah, I got it. But when the last thing goes off, I don't have them say it. I put up a multiple choice test with all the numbers in it. And you go through, and it's D, okay? And everyone goes off the sequence of numbers at some point. E is also wrong. And I ask everyone, what is it? It's D. Did you finish reading A, B, or C? Did you take in the complete answer to? No. Did you even read E? No. Why aren't we trying this for testing anxiety? Why isn't this an intervention? Now you may say, and actually you may say, can we really do that with first graders and third graders? Memory devices? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I still use it to go through files. I can't get away from it. I know where the letters are around my name, my last name. Around G, I'm pretty good. But other than that, I have to many times sing the alphabet to myself. Now that's because it would be very easy. Learning is simple, but not easy. So it would be very simple for me to easily remember where all those things by doing random retrievals and stuff. I just don't want to do it and don't have time and don't need to. I'm fine this way. But we could easily take that knowledge and not have to get to Z by starting at A and be able to pull it out as much as we want. So the idea would be what I would start. All we're talking about at the lower grade levels are more of the basic stuff, which is what your question was. If I don't want them to build a building, I want them to know what the materials are that the building is built out of. And then maybe later on, we can talk about architecture or something like that. The basic foundation of everything is memorizing stuff, encoding, storage, and retrieval. And I'm more than just a one-note memory guy, but that's answering this particular question, is memorizing stuff and then being able to quickly call it up in the moment to use in critical thinking. And this can be done in a very sterile and generic process, which can be fun. That has to do with the motivation piece and creating motivation, which is a wildly misunderstood area in education, as are many things, like the way mindset has turned into a feel-good trope in education, and not at all what Carol Dweck intended it to be, because it's a very powerful and important thing. So that's what I would do. That's what I would recommend. Teach how to learn. And it doesn't take a lot. You could do little here, little there. Teach how to learn, which starts with memorizing. The second phase after that is then have little class discussions in which associative memory will be triggered. If you've been retrieving like I was doing with that teacher group, granted it was one group of numbers, but this can be inculcated easily into lesson plans. If you're then having a discussion that you, of course, very smart teachers, and I'm not placating you, very smart teachers, know I want them to know this. I want them to think of this. If I ask this, that should trigger a discussion. What happens when we have class discussions? Okay. Little slow raise, because they're unsure of their answers. Get that memory in there so they're sure, and watch what happens with a group of kids when they all have things pop into their head that they want to say. It'll change the game. That is a retrieval, a higher level retrieval practice called elaboration, which makes the retrieval even better later on, and then triggers this. And this is controversial, and I won't start talking about it unless you have questions about it, but you can memorize facts without knowing what they mean. And you can put the meaning over them later. And that's what I do. I say the numbers now represent kings and queens of England, and we're going to learn about the succession of the monarchy. And, double-digit numbers are queens, singles are kings, and we can figure out where all the kings and queens are. and then we can skip numbers and go forward and backward. And what a great place to start.
So I want to dig into this idea of the learning how to learn, and I have wrote down a couple things, but I don't think I'm going to wrap it in just yet. So we're talking about learning how to learn. So one, it's, I guess you could say for teachers, it's learning how to teach someone how to learn, right? And for our students, and really for teachers and students to learn how to learn. So as you build these skills, you've described a couple examples of learning how to learn specific content. So if I'm a fifth grade teacher, I was very passionate about student-centered learning. I was very passionate about having my students drive the learning process. And a lot of what I recommend and what I did is I invested my time into my students to be successful decision makers and successful independent learners in my classroom, which slowed me down in the beginning of the year. But as I picked up pace in November, December, January, I was able to deliver, I won't even say deliver instruction, facilitate learning at a much, not even faster pace, just more quality pace, because my students were able to really successfully navigate in that environment. So my question is, as we learn how to learn, and maybe you can add more details into that, are we specifically teaching them how to learn specific concepts, or are we setting the foundation for them understanding how to memorize anything, or to, like, I guess I'm kind of talking in circles here. If I use a strategy to teach them how to memorize a specific thing, did I teach them to memorize that specific thing, or am I also teaching them to learn how to memorize in general?
That's your decision, and the decision should be to teach them both. You should absolutely be teaching the science, teaching the way the brain works, and then showing them with incontrovertible proof their own brains and their own learning, how it works. That's very powerful. It's something
So can you give us an example of how that would work?
Talk about retrieval practice and the testing effect. Just what I do with teachers when we walk through, and I say, now notice how you're going to get some things wrong, but we didn't do any additional study or practice. Notice how you're now getting it right. So a wrong answer, when you've encoded something properly, and we're using encoding techniques, whether it's singing a song or whatever it is, a wrong answer just means you can't retrieve, doesn't mean you don't know it. And then you prove it to them by having them go through it. Everyone will get some wrong at some point, and then notice that they're better at it with no further study. You didn't have to go back and review. You didn't have to do any, if the encoding was good enough. So that would be one way, by explaining the science. And most people don't know the science. It's very compelling. But I would also ask you the same question. I'm curious to get them to that point. If you use the content, is what I'm saying. You use the content to teach the concept. So the content gets you to pass the class. You keep building on the concept. You keep making it bigger and bigger. Now here's how we memorize this. Now, eventually you get to building these elaborate storyboards in your head, which represent, I had one for the Bill of Rights where you can memorize pretty much every word in the Bill of Rights by using these visual concepts. That's something that's built over time. But I'm curious, it seemed what you were saying is that you didn't really start out with any content, but somehow they got to a point where they were mastering the content?
A little bit. So my ultimate goal was to facilitate learning in small groups, whether it was a group of 2, a group of 8, and I was doing that based on their understanding of a skill. So I would meet with groups that had no understanding of the skill, had some understanding, or like already showed mastery and really didn't need any instruction from me. So my goal was to deliver instruction in those groups. But in order for me to work with 4 kids for 5 up to 20 minutes, I need the other 26 kids to be able to do something. So I invested time in them to understand how to, facilitate through the checklist that I would give them of the work they had to do. I use screencast a lot so they could learn through screencast. So as I taught them skills, I would invest time into also how they were going to learn concepts in my class. So the first screencast was a big part of my classroom. So the first time they watched a screencast to learn, we all did it at the same exact time. And I modeled, this is what you do. You have a piece of paper. If I tell you to do a problem, you write it down. If I tell you to write down a definition, you write it down. You pause the video as your copy. So I was teaching them those skills. So then I knew that I could give them that work to do and not worry about those students learning that way independently while I focused on the kids in front of me. Does that answer your question?
It does, and they were more or less 100% of them all on task the whole time when you were with the other groups throughout the year.
You probably have been out of the classroom for a long time for 100% to be on task. No, I mean, overall, they were, but part of it is behavior management, right? Reminding the kids that they're there
Yeah.
to do their work, not to socialize or to balance their social conversations. But that was a part of it that I liked too, because they were learning social skills at the same time. Some of my students learned that if they sat next to their friend, no matter how many times they promised themselves and me that they were going to do their work, they weren't going to do their work. They were going to talk the whole time. And I would say to those students, I'm not going to try to change your behavior, because at some point when you're an adult, your social skills are going to pay off and you're going to make a lot more money as a salesperson than I'm making as a teacher right now. But for right now, you need to not sit next to your friends. Whereas other kids could, and they could successfully work. So they were learning all these skills in Compass while they were exploring the content.
Okay. Yeah.
I was just gonna kind of chime in. So I literally I grabbed out a packet today. I went to our local intermediate unit, which at least in Pennsylvania is like a sector where a lot of public schools go to get training. And Penn State recently put out a specific training around questions and the value of questions and the different styles of questions, which definitely tap into things like metacognition and the concept behind thinking. And some of the things that when listening to what you were saying earlier, found fascinating is a lot of times we ask questions that are 1 second questions, and we are surprised that they give us back 1 second answers. And so when we're doing tasks so frequently where our outcome is to acknowledge only whether they get it or not, then they're missing the point of the questioning. The questioning is to drive the learning, and too often we ask very explicit, direct questions. But just kind of one of the things that stuck out to me was related in this metacognition and creating these opportunities and creating unique ways for them to understand whether it should be rote memorization style activities. Like you said, those baseline academic competencies that you need to have, but you put it with an acronym, or you put it to song, or you put it to a matching game style activity that allows to drive the learning deeper. I think we as educators are really familiar with creating strategies for rote memorization because we ask those questions so much. How do you feel? I think this is where I'm getting to. How do you feel like it's best to structure value in open-ended thinking and activities? Because, like I said, since we're so used to asking basic questions, we're great at creating solutions for that. How do we create structure and control as we really elevate the game?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking. How do we create structure?
Well, I guess my thought. Sorry, I have a 1,000 different thoughts in my head. Yeah,
no, it's okay. Please, it's all good. It's all good.
It comes down to when you were mentioning the idea of those entry level skills that they have to understand. I feel like that's as teachers, we have skills to support that. What I'm looking, I guess, is what is that next step? After we've covered using these skills to learn what needs to be learned, what are some other strategies or things you consider including for more dense tasks that we're trying to teach students?
Well, you'll continue to the whole learning to get stuff into your memory is a pretty complicated thing that you can spend a long time continuing in this kind of spiral retrieval thing going up and up. But like I said earlier, the first thing would be discussions for critical thinking. Have discussions. You were talking about metacognition. The model I use for deliberate practice is this. You plan to do something, then you do it. Here's metacognition. I cannot tell you how many times I've sat in front of when I do music stuff where I'll say someone, I can't get this one part down. I have this real problem with playing this section. I've been working on it for months. Well, play it. How did it just sound? And they're sitting right there and they don't even know. We don't pay attention to what, if you're familiar with Kahneman and his book Thinking Fast and Slow, how we're constantly relying on what he calls the system one thinking, system one, system two thinking. They don't actually exist. It's a continuum. But most of the time, we're not paying attention to what we're doing. We couldn't think about, do I put my one foot in front of the other? Do I now turn the doorknob? How do I pull the door back? So we relegate everything to this type of thinking. So right there is a problem with metacognition. So the first thing I do is have a task. Okay, what's the task? I'm going to plan to do the task. This piece will be the piece you have to build, and it takes a while. And the best way to do it is, as you say, through asking questions. And I mean, maybe a different kind of question. I mean, instead of explicit instruction is very important and has its place, especially in the early stages. Then you get closer to something called the expertise reversal effect, which is when having an expert teach you actually holds you back because you're ready to start doing things more independently. So as you start moving toward that, you can do more and more of this. While you're doing this, ask questions when they have nothing in the retrieval, in the reflection part. For instance, 2 + 2, what is it? 5. Why do you think that? I don't know. Well, how did you come up with the answer? I just guessed. Okay, let's try again. Don't guess. 2 + 2. 7. How'd you come up with 7? What did you think about? And you just keep going. And eventually, and part of that process is going to be when they start to do, and you have to make sure the problem is easy enough, just hard enough so that they don't struggle too much, that they have the basic information in there. They just have to start thinking, because metacognition, you have to build it. It's not something that just happens. And you ask, okay, well, how did you get 7? Well, there were 2 apples and 2 oranges. Okay, how many is that? Count. Can you count? 1? And you gradually, by the way, it's really hard to do this, especially if you haven't done a lot of it before. It hurts to try and think of a way to not say, it's not 6. Come up with the answer. It's not 6. Just count, or something like that. It's very tough to do that. It takes a lot of practice. I mean, it hurt when I used to do it because I was doing deliberate practice, which, as the guy who named deliberate practice says, deliberate practice is not inherently enjoyable, which is my favorite line from that whole study. There's going to be a little pain for a lot of gain. And once you start to get good at something, you become motivated to do more of it. Passion can be created absolutely through learning. This is Zimmerman and his work. So they will start to become more autonomous. But yeah, you want to get that reflection piece going. You want to ask questions. And I mean, at some point about everything. It'll annoy that. If you haven't done it a lot with your students, it'll annoy the heck out of them. It'll annoy the heck out of you. Again, explain the science. Explain that this is retrieval practice. And I'm trying to get you to find the stuff, because if it's too easy, you won't remember it. Your brain won't flag that as something you need to put in your long-term memory to have later. So the questions, the annoying part is what I'd call the burn of learning. And every time kids get really frustrated because they can't learn something, and I assure them they can, I've designed this lesson a certain way. Trust me, you can get it. There's nothing wrong with you. And they will, I can't. And I'll just shout at them, feel the blurn. Okay, just like the guys at the gym do, right? Feel the blurn. And they like that. So you have to come up with ways to explain it like that. They have to know what they're getting into. They cannot have uncertainty. So that's why I start with real easy stuff like dual coding or something like that. So they realize all you have to do is get them to do something they thought they would never be able to do, just a little bit. Say, you didn't think you could do that, did you? And by the way, watch the self-esteem. Self-esteem doesn't cause good grades. Good grades cause self-esteem. That research was very misunderstood and very misused. Get them to do something they couldn't do before. And they will start to become enthusiastic about the learning process. I really question whether we have passion for anything, and whether it's all created rather than inborn. Many times, if you ask someone, what is it you'd like to do? They will choose the easiest thing, because the brain in system 1 does not want to engage itself. It's not laziness. The brain knows it's the most important organ in the body. It cannot store energy. It only uses it in the form of glucose. It wants to not work. It's got to keep your heart beating and make sure you're not falling down when you're walking and do a whole bunch of other stuff. The learning itself takes focus and concentration, which is how new neural networks are built. There's something in your brain called the nucleus basilus, and that is activated when you focus. Before 13, it's always on, but you have to focus to tell it what to learn. This creates new neural networks. So creating this focus is really important, and when they start to get it, they will start to feel really good about themselves because, and as I was saying, the brain is not going to choose to do the hardest thing. It's just, especially the younger you are, it's just not. Your prefrontal cortex isn't formed yet. It's not formed till you're 25, but we can do a lot. We can do a lot to help build it in younger students. In fact, this is what child prodigies are. They have the ability to force themselves to focus on stuff. And as Ellen Winter says, she calls it the rage to master, being really, really into something and just wanting to do it. Well, a lot of times that happens, and every time I'm aware of it, even in my own life, going back and looking at it, it was circumstances that I can tell you. I became a musician in a family where there's no musicians anywhere, and how I ended up getting a master's degree in classical music and starting out playing rock and roll and heavy metal, which makes no sense in my family until you understand certain things that happened when I was a child. And now it makes total sense to me. So I do know this for. Go ahead. I'm sorry. You want to say something?
Yeah, no, it's okay. So I'm understanding this a little bit more, and I want to challenge you and dig into it a little bit more with this idea of the memorization and the recalling and the reflection piece, because I thought it was just interesting. 2 + 2, they don't get it, and we're digging into why. And although it's a basic concept, they can count their way to the answer, so they can eventually reflect on getting to that answer and then having that confirmation. So let's go with, if you don't mind, I want to jump into high school science. They learn cells, or middle school science, whenever they're learning about cells, right? And they need to know the key, any science teacher is going to say, they need to know their vocabulary. They need to know what the nucleus is. They need to know what all the different components of the cell are. So how do we progress through that concept, starting with memorization and then building in activities that are going to draw on that recall, where they're getting some right and some wrong? Can you kind of walk us through and model that a little bit? Or if that doesn't work, maybe a similar concepts?
Upward style retrieval. Okay, so imagine a spiral going up like this. So here you're starting with the very, whatever it is. I don't care if it's a college class. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, you start with the very, very basics, and you start to get this in the memory. Now, while that is in the memory,
can I dig in right there?
Yeah.
What's the best way to do that? Is it give them notes and make them write it down? Is it some sort of kinesthetic activity where they're applying movement to it? What, in your opinion, what's the best way to deliver that initial instruction on vocabulary?
It depends on the age. One of the easiest ways is to do whatever it is you're used to doing, and then quiz, the testing effect. If you've got a clicker in your room or something like that, or I don't know if you know what clickers are, for people who don't have one of those in the something like that in the room. Yes, we want to use that for formative assessment. Sure, formative assessment is great, but it's only a piece. Use it to leverage the testing effect. Every time they try to find a piece of that information, now at first, use it for formative. Okay. Oh, I noticed a third of the class didn't get the third question. We got a problem. Now you can leverage this as well. That means 2/3 of your class did get it right. 2/3. How would you explain it to the third? Now this brings in, again, I call it the ecosystem of learning, the idea of mindset. You're gonna have to get people who you're gonna have to start to inculcate people with a growth mindset so that they don't think mistakes mean that they are a mistake. And this is more than just this feel good kind of, oh, mistakes are okay. They're not okay. You want to fix them. It just means that you're okay. And if you can start to get people to accept that in part of class discussions, don't worry, 2/3. Some of you are going to be in the 1/3 next time, and they're going to be in the 2/3. Get them used to explaining stuff to each other. That would be a great next step right above that, assuming you've done good encoding, whatever methods you use. And there's lots of research for dual coding and many other ways you can get stuff in. There's an interesting book called Powerful Teaching. I have it right here. It's a bit much, I think, sometimes. That's one of the problems on the psychology side. They don't know how to explain stuff in the way real teachers can use in the classroom, like right away. But it's got a lot of good suggestions in there. So you get that done, and then this basic information starts going up the spiral. And now you're doing other things while you're also doing retrieval. Now your retrieval gets better. Now up here is a conversation, a class participation, which is critical thinking. Imagine a class discussion in which everyone could not wait to open their mouths, and kids can't wait to open their mouths. The reason they don't in class discussion is because they cannot retrieve or have not properly stored the information that the conversation, associative memory, triggers. Now, as you're going up this, back here, you're learning the new information above it, because as you get higher in the concept, there's going to be more detailed information. Now you don't just need to know this or that about the cell. You need to know what cytoplasm is. I hope I got that right. I don't even know.
Right. How the components are functioning together and creating systems.
Sure. That would be great. And maybe you just start with 2 or 3 functions. Okay. Or whatever you feel as the teacher, that's your, I don't tell people what to teach. I tell them how to teach. So as you go up, now here's the new thing coming up. And by the way, as you get to mastery, okay, class discussions, and by the way, the beginning level, quizzing, testing, explaining to your kids 100%. Quizzes and tests are not just what you think they are. Get them to understand and experience the testing effect. We are making your memory better so that when you come in for the test, I'm going to digress for just a second here. When I was teaching music, I would tell my kids all the time, if you would do all your classes the way I'm having you do this to be successful, and some weren't until they decided to follow directions, and then they were. I've had interesting stories about creating passion in students like that. I'd say, if you would just do this, what I'm doing here, and that is every night you get your homework assignment, go home and do it the day it's assigned, the way it's assigned. Don't shortcut it. That's not laziness. That's the brain looking to conserve energy. Don't shortcut it. Just do it. And the example I always used to use is when I was in school, when I was your age, I was the same exact age as you are right now. When I was in school, here's how I would do it. I would go get the sheet to go home and read the chapter and fill out the sheet. And I'd go right to the index. And if that didn't work, I'd go to the glossary. And in about 2008, a kid raises his hand and says, "We go to Google." And everyone laughs. Well, you've totally circumvented the learning activity. But that's because all the brain hears is, you get all your credit if you hand in the completed sheet. The assignment is completing the sheet. That's not the assignment. Then I'd explain to them how that assignment actually works, how it's deliberate practice, how it's putting things in the memory, how it's getting you to go back and elaborate on things through doing that sheet so you can get better and better at it. And so I told them, if you would just go and do this, and if you don't understand something, and I would say pick one class, just pick one class, pick a terminus point after a test, beginning of a semester, whatever it is. Pick a terminus point. So now you're going to have 2 weeks until the next large assessment, or 3, or whatever the days are, and do the whole thing this way. I had 12 or 13 kids in 13 years take me up on this. Every single time they would come running out to my classroom at lunch or break. Mr. Goodhart, I tried it. It worked. I barely studied beforehand. I just reviewed a little bit and all the answers popped into my head. And you know what happened next? They stopped doing it. And this isn't just kids in high school. This happens with medical students who learn these techniques as well. It is part of the human condition to circumvent the hard work to get that done. So I'm sorry, I got off topic a little bit because this related to, but wasn't the actual answer of this kind of retrieval going upwards. So as you go up, now you're doing quizzes and quizzes. They understand exactly why. We're leveraging the testing effect. These are, from what I've heard, they're supposed to be low stakes, but they're supposed to carry some points or something. Then I read from another researcher who worked with that researcher that said, it doesn't have to be any points. So here's where I'm at on that. Make it points that don't matter. Don't tell them. Just make it points that don't matter. It doesn't work 3 points. And, at the end of the semester, you have 1,900 points. So you're going to have 20 of them. And then you go in and you look, and if it's affecting someone's grade, you take it out or whatever it is. Make it inconsequential. I don't mind with no points or with some that are just inconsequential. And understand, when you get a wrong answer, you are learning. That struggle is the learning. This is what I was just thinking of when you were talking, and I want to bring this up. Robert Bjork and his wife Elizabeth at UCLA are wonderful researchers who have something called the Forgetting Lab over there. And boy, there's great work there. And they asked him in a podcast, if you like, I can send you the information on it because I use it in all my talks. And he said, what's the single biggest problem in learning? And he said, without hesitation, judging your learning in the moment. If we judge our learning in the moment, we will make all sorts of mistakes on what to study, when to stop studying, when we know something. By the way, this is where most testing anxiety, that which is not legitimate social anxiety disorder. This is where most testing anxiety comes from, thinking we've got something when we don't. Because, and I taught this way for years and years and years, and I taught mostly music. I taught some book classes too about music. But for years and years, I did this too. Let's figure out how to get better at this. If they didn't get better right away or within a minute or whatever, I was failing and needed to figure something else out. Oh, goodness, no, that's not true. Judging that in the moment leads to things like testing anxiety. You don't really know what you thought you knew because everything is still there's something called the forgetting curve. We all know from when you do something and you memorize it or have it memorized to the next time you do it. I don't care if you've done it a billion times. If it's been 5 years, you're going to have a hard time remembering. So that curve starts going pretty quickly. But it doesn't go down within the course of a single lesson, assuming we're talking 15, 20, 30 minutes. You know, if the lesson's all day long, it's something else. So what we're looking at is the forgetting curve not diminishing. What we need to do is do what's going to be in the real world and on our tests. That is, you're going to be sitting there having not just studied this that day, the day before, a week ago. You're going to have to call all this stuff up. And if you think about it, anything we're passionate about, anything that we really like, that we spend time learning, we can have discussions. Working memory holds 7 to 9 pieces of information at a time. Long-term memory is limitless. Nobody knows what the limit is. It has been tested, and the limits keep getting higher and higher as we use different methods to do it. So you can get as much. So once you stop using your working memory and keeping that forgetting curve here, and really get into the real world, when we have those discussions about, I don't care, football and the tight end in that offense, whatever, you are calling to bear a bunch of information. If someone starts talking about tight ends in football, you're thinking about all the tight ends that you know about, and well, this guy could do that and that. That's not in your working memory. It's because you've not only memorized that stuff through repetition, you've also experienced it in multivariate situations. Watch a football game. That's multivariate situations. What happened here, what happened there, and that makes it stick. That's why they call the book Make It Stick. And so we go up this retrieval thing. Here's the interesting thing, by the way, is we get up here, guess what? As we're completing this, a couple more spirals, it gets more difficult assignments, more difficult to test. Right about here somewhere, we don't really need to do so much basic retrieval anymore. Now we can start putting in the stuff for the next unit. And it's not going to interfere with the previous unit at all. Basic stuff that they may not even know the definition of. So maybe something after the cells that's bigger and bigger, how they clean themselves out and dispose of waste or something like that. And you can just learn the term. I mean, if I know what happens in sleep. It's called metabolite clearance. It's how we get the junk out of our brains. We've only known that since 2014, oddly enough. Okay, well, maybe I start, obviously not with a fourth grader, when I talk probably about metabolite clearance, but I'd say memorize the word metabolite, memorize the word clearance. Let's put it together. That sort of thing.
So I guess one of the things that, first off, I feel almost incompetent to have a conversation with you because, from our understanding right now, I almost feel like we can recognize pedagogy, and that pedagogy and an understanding of pedagogy influences how we teach. So just kind of, I don't want to summarize it, but for us as classroom teachers, like how you've kind of talked about it in a few times, like how do we best impact students' mindsets in a positive attitude towards learning, taking all of that information you have?
Well, first, you can't do it taking all the information that I have. You have to start one thing at a time. And this is interesting because it's what I noticed the first few years I got out doing my thing. I still have it. It's a little smaller, but I had like a 38-page handout, which was not a book. It was bulleted, so you didn't have to really read it. And it was each section I talked about. And I would say to the groups I taught, I would say, and everyone, when I would get a chance, we're staying very much on memory in an area, but when you hear the whole thing, it's pretty interesting. All of it's interesting. And, oh, boy, that's great. That's it. And sometimes I go back to these places a couple of years later. Did you use any of it? No. And I would tell them when I was there the first time, say, all you have to do, you've heard of deliberate practice. Are you curious? Just go to that section and start reading the first few things I wrote. And then if you want to go, I've saved you the time of looking for studies and doing all this stuff. Look at what I tell you and then try to prove it wrong. Even better, try to prove it right. That's the best way to find out if something's wrong. But that wouldn't happen. And here's what I realized, and that's when I started creating documents that I called Try This Now. How do you, that's where this came from, this sort of stuff. How do you right now teach deliberate practice in the most basic way? And if you think about it, I don't know if you guys have done reading on deliberate practice. It's been all the rage for about 10 years now. There's whole books on it, even by Anders Ericsson. I don't know how a teacher, especially without background in this stuff, reads one of those books and goes into their classroom on Monday morning and has something to do. And that's part of the problem. So when you say how, I think what I'm hearing you ask is, how do we start doing this? How do we do this? The unfortunate answer is, the big answer, I'll give you the big answer and then the small answer. The big answer is, we're going to have to start teaching teachers this way in college. And we're not. And it is a great failing of our teaching system that we have all this information and we know that it works. It is not only proven, but can be demonstrated. And that's my skill. Demonstrating stuff to people that they don't have the ability to understand right now, but that I can show in a very concrete way, like getting them to memorize a bunch of stuff. Most people in that room didn't believe they could memorize all that stuff, much less answer a multiple choice question at the end of it, much less spend a total of, if you take the retrievals and the time we did it, of like 7 minutes getting it all memorized and then having it perfect. That is enough to start to light the fire with teachers. What you have, and part of my, and the small, so that's that. The big answer is we have to teach this in college. The small answer is we have to start figuring out how to do these individual things and then start building them in the classroom. And that would bring us to the discussion of, and we can go anywhere you want, the ecosystem of learning. There are deliberate practices a piece. Mindset is a piece. And you asked about mindset. We could talk about that. That's more than, you've asked a big question. If you want to talk about mindset, go to Carol Dweck, read her book, and then read the research and understand how, that's kind of what I do, understand how to apply stuff like that. I've got to Try This Now document for mindset. We can talk about how to do that if you want. But this ecosystem of learning, deliberate practice, mindset, flow, all this stuff, real motivation as a motivator, any one piece of this is powerful, because you see people are really jazzed up about, I'm going to teach deliberate practice, and that's their whole thing, and professional development on deliberate practice. And someone else over here is a mindset person. I don't count the people. There's two mindsets. There's mindset as a general term. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Carol Dweck's 30-year plus research project on what she calls growth and fixed mindsets. That's where the money is. But it turns into this feel-good trope. That's a whole other thing. But understanding this. So if you understand one of them, it makes things much more it's going to make your teaching more powerful. If you understand two, it's synergistic, meaning the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This makes this more powerful. This makes this more powerful. And there are numerous elements. I envision the journey of teaching like kind of like a wagon wheel. So you have a wheel. I call that the circumference of ignorance. That's where we all start. We all start in the same place. Everyone starts in the same place. We don't know how to do something. There was a time in all of our lives when we did not know how to teach. Then we started learning how to teach. So whatever it is, we always start on the circumference of ignorance. That's where we start. I call the little hub in the middle, I call that master teacher, mastering. We all travel. This is going to be controversial, but folks, learning works one way. It does not work another way. It has specific elements that are part of it. When we're dancing around all this, but if we do this and if we do that, and it's learning works one way. How we get there can be different for everybody, but learning works one way. And so you have these elements, and we all, as we go through teaching, because we're not taught this in school, you must know this by now because you guys are advanced teachers, you start to pick things up that other people didn't, and you didn't get in school. And you start to pick these little things up, and we start to get them, and they make us better. Some people stop with one or two, okay, because boy, it makes them feel so much more powerful. And sometimes they come in and tell us how we should teach. The more you get of these things, the more powerful each of them gets. And it is completely true that one experienced teacher who is lauded as a great teacher can have all but one element, and a new teacher who has hardly any experience at all can have that one element. So we can learn this stuff from anybody. Most of us, what we really have are very, very relatively small amounts of several of the elements, because you don't learn something without deliberate practice. That's the way it works. Now, deliberate practice is really several things. Naive practice is not that. Purposeful practice, structured practice, all this. The deliberate practice has to have a teacher, which, of course, students aren't going to always have a teacher around. But it's putting also your large question of, is you have to learn how to do each individual thing, okay, understand when to teach it, and then we could talk about that, but that's a big discussion. I mean, if you want to know, I'll tell you how I teach mindset, or this is big. Now, every time we do something, check and make sure you got it right. Let's say it's math homework. Why not go back and redo all the problems backwards? Take the the algebra or whatever, take the thing out and do it backwards. Okay. Nobody does this. Why? Because I completed the assignment and I got my credit. And that's the deal we make with them. Do this and you'll get what you want. That's fine. I got a better idea. Get them to learn so much so quickly that they're enamored with learning. Imagine getting the memory going to the point where a child could memorize in a short period of time, and this doesn't take that long, much more than an adult could, because we don't focus and pay attention. Imagine those conversations on the playground. We memorized all this. Well, I memorized more. Really? Let's see. I can only imagine that kind of stuff going on, but it's just not part of our school systems now.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I understand it's a bigger conversation, but just being something that I keep hearing from you is just being deliberate in what we're doing, how we're doing it, and being explicit with the students so they understand we're going to do this activity because it will help you learn it in this capacity or memorize it in this capacity, or we're doing this quiz so you can see what you've memorized and what you're able to retrieve and what we still need to continue to practice retrieving. And I think that being explicit like that is obviously important for this, like you're saying, but it's just important in general. Just getting students to understand that we do have a reason behind what we're doing and why we're doing it and what we're hoping to accomplish with them. So I could ask you 1,000 more questions, but I do want to be cognizant of our time. So I want to jump into our exit ticket, which is the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. Question number 1, what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
Understand the science. Really understand the science. Not what you hear on the radio, not or TV, because their job is to sell copies of stuff. I just did a recent video blog thing about, I got into music because of the Beatles. I love the Beatles. And there was something in the airport, the neuroscience of creativity, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney on the cover. And of course, I had to buy it. And turns out there's no articles about John and Paul's creativity and neuroscience in there. That was a complete bait and switch. Now, that's a small deception just to sell a magazine, but there are much bigger ones out there too. Remember, most of the stuff that's on TV that's telling you stuff like that wants to tell you something you want to hear rather than tell you the truth. I'm not talking about the big stuff, the political stuff. That's another thing. I'm talking about when it comes to talking about science and research, and it's amazing. You can learn all this stuff. So that's the first thing. Really endeavor to understand it. I'll tell you how I did it, and that's the one difference I have. I found out about the deliberate practicing by reading my favorite book of all time, which I recommend to everyone, called Talent is Overrated. And that goes deep into deliberate practice. And I said, well, I was a department chair at the time, and I said, I can't tell my teachers to read this unless it's true. And I have to do more than listen to this author. So I got the original deliberate practice study, came out in 1993. Took me 2 weeks to read it. I had no background. I didn't understand most of the words. It was hard. I have ADHD as it is, but it was, if you couldn't tell, I had a hard time sitting there and reading, but I forced myself to do it because I knew I needed the information and that I didn't want to give my teacher something that wasn't good. And I think there's too many of us that just get too caught up in getting through the day and instead of genuinely understanding. It was awful. It took me months. And then I realized when I read that, as you might imagine, oh my gosh, I got to read 3 more things now. And then those 3 things led to 20 things. And I'll never forget where I was. I was in a train going to a Learning in the Brain conference in San Francisco. I was up there and I was reading about something and it was a big deal. It really connected for me. And I realized I was having fun reading this stuff. It took almost a year because you have to get through the difficult part. You have to feel the blur as you're learning stuff. So this is a tall ask for teachers. But understand the science, really understand the science. And that's what I do, is explain it in a way. It's just a way to start. I can't give you all of the knowledge in a short period of time, but start experimenting with this stuff one at a time. Maybe decide to teach a unit on deliberate practice, but really understand deliberate practice. Understand there's a lot of supposition and misinformation because of supposition, and something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Beware of the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you've never heard of it, and maybe some of your listeners haven't. It's research that shows the less you know about something, the more confident you will be that you are doing it right when you're doing it wrong. This is because you do not have a mental model by which to judge what you are doing. So the irony is when we're first learning something, we will know very little about what we need to do to get better at it because we don't have that mental model built. As we get better at it, we build the mental model and can get better at it. So if we get a little bit of science and all of a sudden think we've really got it together and start teaching that way, beware of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Do you really know?
I'm very excited about this next question. So you have shared tons of great knowledge, but what is a piece of advice, maybe the best piece of advice that sticks out to you that you received from even a colleague, supervisor, or even a student of yours?
I already used the one from Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. That was a good one. That's probably the best piece of advice I've gotten. Boy, all of it came through the science. I really can't. This is going to sound weird, but I had a principal at one point. He used to go on and on and on about Bloom's taxonomy. Lots of good stuff in there. And I said, boy, after a while, I remember saying in a faculty meeting, I said, do we have a copy of that here? I think I'd like to read it. Turned out we didn't. And I think that was the seed for me realizing, oh my gosh, even the people we think that know it don't. I got to figure this out for myself. And all I wanted was to teach a little bit better, was to learn a little bit about this. So maybe the best advice I ever got was from someone who didn't know what advice they were giving.
I often think sometimes the best way to learn is to watch people doing it the wrong way.
What not to do.
Yeah. That's not the way that I want to do it.
It really is true.
So adding kind of to that, I think we all understand school years for us teachers go in waves, and there are days, possibly weeks, that we struggle to survive. Referencing something like conferences or report cards or just, really challenging times in a school year. What's something you feel like every educator needs to hear to power up through those moments of real struggle?
Well, the mindset thing, which is transparency and learning, the honest appraisal that you are too busy for reasons you should not be busy. This is one of the several reasons that there is a problem between the science and its application in the classroom. That's why one of the reasons why this gap exists. There's plenty of problems on both sides. Each side is responsible in their own way for this. But that particular thing, that we burden teachers with things they really shouldn't have to do. Too many things. And those are the things we're forced to do. Now, what about the other things when teachers say, oh, little Johnny showed up to my class and I found out he was hungry, so I had to go find and give him some food. Now add those things on top of it. I don't think there's anything we can do about it right now. It is what it is. It works the way it works. I think we can realize it, understand we have this disadvantage, and then build a lesson plan, how we're going to teach ourselves this stuff. And this is kind of going back to start very simple. So during those times, I would say the thing what held me up during those times, it's my job and I have to do it. That's what held me. And I love my job. And I hate this part of my job. And I just have to do it. I will never forget being a music teacher between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Oh my gosh. Everyone thinks you've got all the time in the world to come play at their banquet or their event. And they only call you, at the end of November and give you all these reasons why the band should, or the guitar program or whatever it is, should come play. I used to say, during that period of the year, I used to say, I hold my nose, I go underwater, and I don't come up for breath until Christmas break. And during those times, everything was put aside. Now, that's a different time of the year for music teachers because we have a concert coming up, so we're pretty much to the end of what we're doing. I'm not saying necessarily that you check out, because I checked out of a lot of other stuff during that time. I was 100%, what are my kids doing, as far as their performances go, which was great experience. You can't not do that. So the best I can say is, you suck it up, but let's take the time. Where'd that time come from when you heard about that thing that you wanted to try in your classroom that you never even really tried that much? You had the time to learn about it. Why not be intentional with small bits of time? That will carry you through the larger. Boy, you start teaching this way and you watch what happens. There was a study done by the guys who wrote Make It Stick. They were part of it, Roediger and those guys, in Columbia, Missouri. And I know this because I'm from Illinois. I know Columbia, Missouri. And they were able to move grades across the board in classes where they did everything from C to A, average grades from C to A. Do that and see how much better those difficult times are when you know you have that going for you. It can be less frustrating when we know how learning works and we can have this great success. And I promise you, it is absolutely possible to have way, way better learning outcomes than we struggle for with less work, but you got to have more knowledge to do it that way. That's probably the best advice I can offer there.
Excellent. Thank you. So it's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What separates teachers who are the ones constantly seeking to change, innovate, and adopt new teaching strategies?
Well, they know how to deal with those times when they're not happy with their job. I'm half joking. You just actually kind of said the answer that I gave. Start doing things that bring you to somewhere else. What was the last part of your question? What do I advise?
What do you think separates those teachers that are the ones willing to constantly try those things?
That's an excellent question. And I'm not saying because I don't have an answer. Some of it is desire. Some of it is that it's a relatively thankless job and many people just want to get through the day. You have to really, not just the saying, you have to really care that your kids learn. And you will bend over backwards to get it done. That's why I did what I did. When I first got my job teaching music at a music store, this is a long time ago when I was still in college, I realized that I was a musician and not a teacher. And I felt guilty taking money from people if I didn't know what I was doing. So I started studying like crazy. What that is passion. I've said many times something to the effect of, if you don't have a passion to do this right, please run from teaching. There are many jobs you can get where you just show up and check a box. There are many jobs you can get where you can probably do pretty well if you show up and check a box. But in this profession, we have kids' brains in our hands. And I always make some joke about them being gooey there and wash your hands. But there's too much at stake to not take this seriously. There's too much on you. You are like a surgeon. And by the way, teaching is brain surgery. When we go in with scalpels and everything, we are changing parts of the brain. Neuroplasticity is very clear. Learning changes parts of the brain either physically or functionally. I think we all know about neuroplasticity and how that happens. And when we go in with specific information using specific techniques, we are changing parts of their brain, just as we might with a scalpel. In fact, we're doing a much better job than we can do with any equipment we have right now. That is the most important thing. The only thing I can think that's more important is the medical profession. Let's keep people alive. And the security profession. Let's keep people alive and safe. And then right after that is the development of our kids. So it's hard to say, what is it? It's a desire to do right by our students. And unfortunately, see, I guess I'm kind of more comfortable saying this because I don't think people who think that way are listening to your podcast. Or maybe they are and they need a kick in the butt. There's nothing wrong with you. It is frustrating. I understand. Doesn't mean there aren't solutions. And by the way, you start understanding the science and it will get, one of the things that's frustrating about teaching is, I just can't do it. I just can't. It's just, I try and they all don't get it. Well, there's a solution out there. There's an answer out there. It's in the cognitive science, the way to get everybody to learn and learn at rates that we thought were previously not possible. When I say we, the teacher side, the researcher side know about this. But yes, our jobs are, I say this all the time, our jobs are far too important not to take very seriously. And that's the only message I can give. And that's not a common, and society sends us a message that, teaching, you just tell people stuff you know. Oh, I respect teachers. What they mean is you respect that you have a job, that you have some crappy parts, and you have to put up with some difficult parents. You have to put up with, they don't respect your intellect. I don't respect the hard job is a stockbroker. The hard job is managing a business. Yeah, hard job is learning how to teach. And that's just getting into it in the first place. Then the hard job starts. How do we teach how to learn? And if we're not motivated to do that, the only thing I can say, and I say it with great compassion and understanding, please don't teach. Just please don't. Just do something else in which it's okay that you don't design brakes for cars either, right? Don't do things of great consequence to people's lives unless you take it. And what I always say is it's interesting to look at what I call no-fail jobs and how they're taught. Pilot, doctor, lawyer. Look how they train them. Years and years in school. Then you have to do what do we have in teaching? 1 year practicum. 1 year as a student teacher, then you're ready. And then you're supposed to take care of all your professional development after the 4 year and then 1 year on your own in an environment that doesn't pay well for people to do professional development. How do we do it in medicine? You don't get to operate on anyone until you've spent at least 10 years going through the levels with it's called a mentorship an apprenticeship program. That's how the apprenticeship model works. Why do we do it that way for pilots, doctors? Because they're no-fail jobs. If you fail when you go solo the first time, someone dies or has a massively bad outcome that really affects their lives. Those are how we know how to teach no-fail jobs. We know how to produce people who will not fail at what they do when they get behind the whatever it's called in the cockpit, the yoke, I think, or whatever it is in the cockpit, when they have to grab a scalpel and go into. Yet we do not treat teaching as a no-fail job. And we'd have different, now, who in the heck's going to go through 10 years of school to be a teacher for that pay? That's another problem. But we should be looking at this like we are doctors for pilots.
Totally makes sense. It has been a privilege to talk to you and steal a few ideas from you. And I know you have so much to offer us and our audience. How can we continue to connect with you going forward and, steal some more of this knowledge that you've accumulated?
Steal, and steal some more. That's what I say. That's how we get good at stuff. Just don't steal copyrighted stuff. Trust me on that one. Learn your copyright law. It'll come back and get you someday. I have a website, greggoodhart.com, GREGGGOODHART. Some poor sap out there is walking around without a G in his name because I took too many of them. Like people call him Airy instead of Gary. My mom said I'm special. That's why I have two G's at the end of my name. And actually, you'll find it's general skill development. And I have a section for academics, a section for sports, and a section for music. Music being just where I ended up doing the most when I started out because I already knew people in that and could get gigs talking to people. I'm also currently writing a book on I wrote a book on learning music, all of which applies to learning anything else. And I'm currently working on a book, so you can sign up there and get updates on my website. But there's tons of stuff. There's a whole section of scientific studies with little explanations as to what you'll read. Recommended reading that's free. Recommended reading for books. My overview of the presentations with all that bulleted stuff and research and say free on my website, et cetera, et cetera. So there's tons of information there. And well, I shouldn't say it, but if you have a question, send me an email. And I do too much of that too, but it's too important, So yeah, that's my website.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we will link up to that on our show notes page as well as our website so that they can find that. Like you said, there's a lot of great information. I was digging around before we connected. A lot of the books that you referenced, you have linked right up here on the website with a description as well, which I thought was nice to see. So Greg, thank you again. This was really helpful. It's good for us to remember. It's good for us to have a starting point to dig into, to think about just the simple approach to what we're doing with, some of those more basic concepts that, like you said in the beginning of the show, has kind of taken a negative connotation on because we're trying to do so much more with students and elicit critical thinking and higher level thinking skills and collaboration. And all those are important. But like you said so clearly, memorizing and understanding basic content is going to help those conversations thrive. So this was a good reminder and a good point for us to dig back and do a little bit more research and refinement on that. So thank you so much for joining us. And to our listeners, thank you again, as always, for following along with us. If this is your first time listening, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next week. And Mr. Rogers.
All right, Greg, you have surely left us powered up as we power down this episode. Thank you for your time, and for our audience, we will talk to you next week.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.